We are now going to continue with the party system of Brazil's First Republic, which in many ways is the polar opposite of the hyperfluid party system that we saw in Costa Rica last time. Political party structures during the Old Republic are highly stable, but political elites in Brazil have organized these parties in a way that ensures that they almost never face any meaningful competition. The parties of Brazil's Old Republic take the form of intensely hierarchical political machines that offer no place for the sort of party activism that we saw develop in Uruguay and Chile by the early 20th century. The last time that we covered Brazilian politics, we saw that the monarchy was overthrown in 1889 by a group of disgruntled military officers who had aligned themselves with Brazil's Republican movement. This 1889 coup culminated in the complete destruction of the highly centralized constitutional monarchy that had reigned in Brazil throughout most of the 19th century. The Brazilian royal family was exiled to France, and most of the land-owning aristocrats who had served as prime minister over the last several decades either went into exile as well, or they dropped out of Brazilian national politics for good. However, many of the lower-level officials and backbenchers in parliament stuck around after the monarchy fell. Brazil's liberal and conservative parties were both finished as viable political organizations, but many low-ranking liberal and conservative politicians found a new home in their state's local Republican Party, which now monopolized power in Brazil. The Republican parties were happy to co-opt experienced politicians from the liberal and conservative parties because in doing so, they secured the dominance of their local political machines by eliminating the danger that anyone might form a viable opposition party. For their part, the liberal and conservative elites soon found themselves quite at home in these new Republican parties. The Republicans who had helped overthrow the monarchy were hardly radical revolutionaries. Their ranks contained many large landowners who had turned against the monarchy not because it was too conservative, but because it was too progressive and it kept doing things like abolishing slavery. The Republican parties had some professional middle-class support, but they were primarily the parties of the landed oligarchy. The new republic's motto, Ordem e Progresso, order and progress, aptly sums up what the Republicans were all about. They wanted to defend the pre-existing social and racial order while simultaneously dragging Brazil into the modern era. And in this sense, the Brazilian Republicans share many of the same goals as other late 19th century liberal regimes that we have already seen, such as the Porfiriato in Mexico and the National Autonomous Party in Argentina. One of the most important institutional changes that takes place in Brazil after the fall of the monarchy is the extreme decentralization of power. The national government loses most of the functions and authorities that it had under the monarchy, and the state-level governments become much more central to day-to-day governance under the Old Republic. The structure of Brazil's party system reflects the primacy of state-level politics. Instead of a single national-level Republican Party, Brazil has a dozen separate Republican political machines, most of which operate within the borders of only a single state. These Republican parties are hegemonic forces within their respective states. In most states, there is no viable political alternative to the Republican political machine, and the only way to hold elected office is to join the Republican Party. Although these parties do not have any national party structure that unites them together, they are in constant negotiation with each other over national level policy and candidacies in presidential elections. By the late 1890s, the machines from Brazil's two largest states, Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo, form a stable alliance for the purpose of steering Brazil's national level politics. Together, these two political machines control around a third of the country's votes, and that means that the candidate that these two political machines coordinate on will usually win the presidential election. In fact, during the decades that this alliance remained in place, the alliance lost the presidential election only once, in 1910, and that was only because nearly every other state in the country had aligned against them. Most of the time, the machines from Brazil's other states are willing to fall in line behind whichever candidate Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo pick. And most presidential elections are decided by overwhelming 90% margins that indicate no real electoral competition. As we can see from this chart, the political machines of Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo are also pretty careful to alternate the presidency between them. The two states essentially take turns holding the presidency throughout the Old Republic period. Presidents are careful to distribute cabinet positions between politicians from multiple different states. And this helps ensure that every state machine has a voice in how the national government is being run. But this national government is no longer what it was under the monarchy. It is important for foreign policy and for carrying out large-scale public works projects like the construction of railroads and dams, but most of the day-to-day governance now happens at the state level. State governors are the central actors in their local political machines, and for that reason, they are also the central actors in Brazil's political system as a whole during the Old Republic period. The whole point of the state political machines is to regulate political competition between each state's local elite and ensure that this competition takes place in a way that never poses a threat to the machine's dominance. If you are an aspiring politician, you simply do not run against your state's political machine. Instead, you join it and you cozy up to your state's governor in the hope that your machine will promote you sometime in the future. These political machines have a monopoly on politics in their respective states, and since congressional elections take place through statewide districts, the members of National Congress owe their seats in Congress to the local political machine. And in this way, the governors and the machines that they run have an indirect but very powerful influence over national policymaking. The leaders of the state political machine also control a network of lower-level political bosses that are known as the coronéis. The singular for coronéis is coronel, which is a cognate for the English word colonel. But the position of coronel is not normally a military rank in this context. It is more of an honorific title, and in that sense, it is somewhat analogous to the Southern colonel in the United States. The Brazilian coronel is typically a landowner, though he can sometimes be a businessman or lawyer instead. He may aspire to holding a senior position in the state political machine someday, but in the meantime, the coronel's job is to do all of the dirty work that maintains the machine's control over local politics. The coronel is effectively the mayor, sheriff, and judge, all rolled into a single person. Some of the most successful coronéis might control the politics of several municipalities at once. For example, the infamous coronel pictured here, Horácio de Matos, eventually gained control over an entire region of the state of Bahia known as the Sertão. Though more typically, a coronel was responsible for just a single municipality. When Americans hear the word municipality, we normally think of a city. But during this period, the Brazilian municipality is more analogous to the American county. The municipality's seat or capital might have a couple thousand people living in it, and the municipality might also contain a couple of smaller towns that have a few hundred residents each. But most of the municipality's population lives in rural areas at this time. Even in relatively populous states like Minas Gerais, only around 10% of the population resides in the municipal seat, while the vast majority of people live in fully rural areas. The economy of the Old Republic is still a primarily agrarian economy, and the elite does not really want people to migrate to the cities, because Brazil's agricultural exports like coffee, sugar, and cotton are much more economically valuable than whatever manufactured goods might be produced in the cities. A primarily rural population is also easier for the state machines to control, and controlling the rural population is really the essence of the coronel's job. The machine relies on the coronel to keep an eye on what is happening in his little municipality and to make sure that everyone stays exactly where they are supposed to be. One part of the coronel's job is to mobilize people to vote for the political machine's candidates on election day. Voting during this era was nicknamed the voto de cabresto, or the halter vote, because voting was so meaningless that the coronel figuratively had to round up voters like livestock and drag them to the polling place in a halter in order to get them to participate. But even after this mobilization by the coronéis, only a very small share of the population was voting during this period. On average, the voting electorate in national elections accounted for only 2% of the national population during the Old Republic. When he wasn't dragging people to vote, the coronel was responsible for maintaining order in his municipality, and the threat and use of violence was a central part of the coronel's authority. The coronel would recruit a gang of close friends and followers who were responsible for cracking down on bandits, meting out punishments, and keeping the local population in line more broadly. Although some states had their own state-level police forces, the state police did not usually involve itself in local affairs unless things really got out of hand. So in most rural areas of Brazil, the gangs controlled by the local coronel were the only real authority in your municipality. They would be prone to all of the abuses that are normally associated with a politically unaccountable police force. And there would often be only a very thin line separating the coronel's enforcers from the bandits that they were supposedly protecting the people against. The relative peace that prevailed in Brazil during the height of the monarchy is largely over by the time of the Old Republic. Local politics is now a violent affair throughout much of Brazil by the early 20th century. In some cases, this violence is directed against the national government or the state machine, but much of the violence takes the form of local wars between rival coronéis. Although the jurisdictions of the state political machines are carefully geographically defined, the jurisdictions of an individual coronel is much more fluid, and the coronéis are often fighting against each other for territory. A coronel may also have to face violent challenges from potential rivals within his own jurisdiction who covet his job. The state political machine only needs one coronel in any one municipality. So if you want to become the coronel and your municipality already has one, the quickest way to get the position was by either overthrowing or assassinating the current coronel. This is a hierarchical and often very brutal political system, and it just does not have any room for the style of autonomous ideological party activism that we saw develop in Uruguay and Chile. Parties recruit activists when they face intense electoral competition from strong rival parties, and they need activists to mobilize additional voters into the party. But with a few exceptions, this sort of competition just does not exist in Brazil in the early 20th century. By design, every political machine has a local monopoly over its own state's politics, and these machines are not very interested in broadening their base of support or encouraging popular participation in politics. At best, party activists would only get in the way of the corones, and at worst, they would risk spreading dangerous political ideas that would make the rural population less docile and harder to control. Now, life looks a bit different in Brazil's cities during this period, but the cities of the Old Republic are hardly the cities that they are today. In the year 1900, Sao Paulo has only around 250,000 residents, making it roughly the same size as regional American cities like New Orleans or Milwaukee around the same time. Rio de Janeiro, Brazil's largest city and the national capital of the Old Republic, is only slightly larger than Boston in the year 1900. Urbanization in Brazil is only just getting underway by the time of the Old Republic, so urban residents still make up a very small share of the national population. The cities are the places where the political machine's control is the weakest, but precisely for that reason, the state machine is careful to keep the voter rolls in urban areas as small as possible so that no rival political faction based in the cities will ever have enough votes to challenge the machine's dominance. For example, the capital of the powerful state of Minas Gerais, Belo Horizonte, had fewer than 5,000 registered voters throughout most of the Old Republic period. To the extent that the residents of the cities are participating in politics, they are doing so through means other than elections. The larger cities like Sao Paulo and Rio developed powerful anarchist labor movements during this period that resemble the anarchist movements that we saw in Buenos Aires and Montevideo. The national capital, Rio de Janeiro, is also the site of various protest movements and insurrections throughout the Old Republic period. Because the president and members of Congress reside in Rio de Janeiro, protests are a bit more effective there than they would be in other cities. But these protests do not usually have any major political consequences. They are mostly just a way for the politically marginalized urban professional class to blow off some steam. Urban political movements do not pose a significant threat to this political system because these movements are never going to be large enough or well organized enough to defeat the reigning political machines on their own. The people who do pose a significant threat to the system are the members of the military. And in our next video, we are going to watch a group of disgruntled junior army officers tear down the old oligarchic political order, not only in Brazil, but throughout much of Latin America as well. Because we are now up to the year 1930 in our story. The traditional oligarchies are collapsing, and from here on out, the military as an institution is going to be playing a much more active role in Latin American politics.